In this video, I'm going to be discussing leash reactive dogs. I'm going to go ahead and start with showing you a clip of a dog I worked with a while back, and I'm going to show you kind of the before and after. So let's go ahead and show that clip.
Come around here. Walk a circle around it.
Okay, so when we are dealing with what most people call leash reactive dogs, and when I say leash reactive dogs, these are dogs that when they see other dogs, they have a propensity to lunge at the leash, bark, and vocalize. Now, we can separate these dogs generally into two different categories. There are other reasons why dogs will be leash reactive, but for the most part, it's two different reasons. One is frustration. So dogs that become frustrated when they see other dogs, they want to interact with the dog, and they do pretty well for the most part if you take them to a dog park or you take them to a doggy daycare. Their play sometimes is really intense, but they're usually able to be somewhat okay in interacting with other dogs. Then we have another category, which are fearful dogs. Now these dogs are afraid of the possibility of interacting with other dogs. And you may get some bleed over in between these two. So one dog may be wanting to interact, but it's also a little bit anxious and nervous. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to kind of separate them. So you have dogs that become leash reactive because they're frustrated, they want to interact with dogs, and then other dogs that are leash reactive because they are fearful. So let's talk about some of the causes and why these dogs become leash reactive. So a dog that is frustrated, they want to interact with the dog, and then when you're walking them, the leash holds them back from the possibility of interacting, and this builds frustration. So because the dog is not allowed to interact with the other dog, they get frustrated and they start to bark and vocalize. And often these dogs that are frustrated, sometimes you'll even notice that the bark is higher in pitch. It's not always the case, but that is something that I do see often. And then you have dogs that are fearful, and they have learned that barking and reacting keeps dogs away from them. So if a dog is afraid of the possibility of interacting with the dog, when the owner is walking them down the street, at some point they've started to bark, growl possibly, and the other owner just naturally just walks by. But from the dog's perspective, they think that this is a good strategy for them because they think this is keeping them safe, that by acting this way, this is keeping the other dog away from them. And you will see almost this snowball effect where maybe it starts at some point and then it just gets stronger and stronger and stronger until you have a dog that's just completely explosive on the leash. The dog looks like it wants to attack the other dog, but in reality it's afraid. So if you take that fearful dog and you put them in a field, so if I have a dog that's on leash, you take a fearful dog and you walk them, say 50, 75, 100 yards away, and you let that dog off leash, it may charge for a little bit, but then at some point it's going to stop and it's going to stay away from that other dog. And so these fearful dogs, they don't want to make contact with the other dog, even though it really looks like that when they're on leash. Okay, so let's talk about some things that you really want to avoid if you have a dog that is reacting this way when they see other dogs. One, you want to make sure that you're not walking your dog in areas where there are going to be loose dogs run up on your dog, especially with fearful dogs. All right, that breaks their trust, and then they think that they need to even make a bigger show and become more defensive to try to keep these dogs at bay. So this also is what often causes leash reactivity in the first place. You can have a dog that's very normal, and then they have a couple instances where loose dogs run up on them and they have a really bad experience, so they start to see other dogs even on leash and they think that's going to happen again. So it's really important, especially when you're trying to train this out of your dog, that you're not taking them to areas where loose dogs are going to be running up on them. Another thing that you want to avoid, especially with the frustrated dogs, is letting your dog go out and meet other dogs on the leash all the time. If you set that expectation up, then of course when your dog sees another dog and they think they're going to be able to interact, well, they're going to become frustrated when you're trying to hold them back. So usually when I'm out with my dogs on the leash, I don't allow them to interact with any other dogs on the leash. This is also a safety issue because a lot of people do not really know their dogs that well, and they could have a dog that may, they could bite your dog, it could act in a very aggressive manner, which then causes your own dog to have some issues later on. So I typically stay away from allowing dogs to interact with each other on leash. I really don't think it serves them any benefit. If I'm going to allow dogs to interact with each other, I want to know about the other dog, and then for the most part, I'm going to be doing it off leash. Let's talk about some things that will help you start to improve your dog's response to seeing other dogs on leash. And one of the first things that I think a lot of dog owners really don't pay attention to, and sometimes even trainers, is that it's not just how you handle the dog's response to other dogs while they're on leash, it's your overall relationship with your dog. So anytime we bring a dog in for leash reactivity with board and train, we don't do that many different things that we do with all the other dogs. And so we're training them how to do things like developing a solid stay, developing good leash walking skills, and all these things really matter. So there are some tricks and tips you can do to just target the leash reactivity, and I will talk about some of those, but you really need to focus on getting your dog to respond to you overall just around the home. For instance, if your dog can't do a 2 or 3 minute stay inside the home when maybe a guest walks in your door, what's going to be really difficult to expect your dog to not react out in public when you don't have near as much control over the environment. So you really want to start to be training your dog in a lot of other commands, and this is really going to help with the leash reactivity in and of itself. Another thing is just teaching good leash walking manners. You know, a lot of the times, I'd say the majority of the time, when I have a client come to me with leash reactivity problems, the dog is pretty bad on leash. They typically are pulling very hard on the leash, and anytime there's tension on that leash, that increases reactivity, especially with fearful dogs, because when they feel that tension on the leash, they feel like they can't escape. And so if you have a dog that is leash reactive, you really want to be focused on teaching good loose leash walking, because having slack in that leash will really help your dog's response. We often tend to prep our dogs for the reactive response. So if you have a dog that's been reacting to other dogs, we see a dog and we get nervous and we start to clench up on that leash, and this telegraphs that to the dog where they start to prepare themselves. So you really want to focus on what your leash is doing and trying to keep it as slack as possible while you're working with your dog. One of the most important things that you can do is start to build engagement with you when you're out and about with your dog. And we usually do this with either high value food rewards or toys. Tug is a great way to get your dog to engage with you if your dog really likes to play tug. If your dog is not so keen on tug, then you can use food rewards. And what we do is, when the dog sees another dog, we work on trying to get the dog's attention immediately back onto us so that they receive something that they really like. And this works well with fearful dogs because they're ultimately afraid of other dogs, so we try to create these positive associations. Some trainers will often refer to this as counter conditioning, right? So if the dog is afraid when they see another dog, we show the dog that upon the sight of seeing another dog, something really good happens. And we try to do this as often as possible so the dog changes its emotional response to that other dog, or what we could call the trigger. All right, so I would recommend definitely taking high value food rewards and trying to make these positive associations. And it's really important that you're trying to increase value in the food. So if your dog is kind of a picky eater, you really want to try to start schedule feeding or possibly start hand feeding in the house and then on your walk, so that you increase value of the food. These dogs start to come out on their walks and they get into this scanning mindset in a very defensive way versus thinking that we want them seeking things from us. So that's another thing that you want to start to incorporate. Now, even though we're trying to redirect the dogs to food and toys, that sometimes with some dogs that's all you need to do, right? With other dogs, you have to really interrupt that behavior, because especially with fearful dogs, we know that behavior is self-reinforcing. So the dog thinks that when they bark and lunge, that's keeping them away. So anytime the dog goes into this reactive state, from the dog's perspective, it is working. So this is why a lot of trainers talk about keeping the dog under threshold, right? So they're trying to keep the dog at a distance before they start to spill into this very reactive state. And now, I think that ideally you're able to do that, but I also know that sometimes that's unrealistic, especially in cities where I often work, like Seattle. There's dogs everywhere, and you can't necessarily control your distance from all these dogs. So there are times when you have to interrupt that behavior. But you have to be careful with interrupting this behavior, because especially if you're starting to introduce things that we would consider corrections or punishment. And this often needs to be done by a professional trainer, because if all of a sudden, let's say that I interrupt the behavior by popping the dogs on the leash, or saying no really loudly, or correcting with, say, something like an air compressor, like a pet corrector. If you do this the wrong way, then the dog starts to associate the other dog with something bad, right? I'll give you a common example is sometimes I've had clients come to me that their dog has been leash reactive. They went and bought an e-collar and they started using it at high levels. And now what happens is the dog starts to associate the other dog with something very uncomfortable. All right. Now, e-collars can be used to resolve leash reactivity. Trainers do it every day. I'm not saying that. But you have to be super careful when you're dealing with a fearful dog and how you introduce what we would call punishment. All right. Sometimes it's necessary, I think, for certain dogs so that you can get back to feeding the dog. So you're showing the dog that you can't do this lunging, barking, growling. And once you stop that behavior and you interrupt that behavior, then you get back to feeding the dog to try to build its confidence. But it's tricky, and I highly recommend, if you have a dog that's highly leash reactive and you're trying to do engagement with food and it's not working and you're thinking about trying something else, you really need to discuss this with a professional trainer. As you're working through leash reactivity, I can definitely tell you that it is not a smooth process. So usually we describe leash reactivity as far as how it improves. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and you hopefully that you're trying to get better and better and better. So you need to kind of look at this over a week, 2 week to 3 week or a month process, because it matters so much on what the other dog is doing and what kind of signals the other dog is throwing out to your dog. So, and then you will also have what I call flare-ups. So you may see that you started to make real progress. It's been a month of you training, and then you have a really bad day. And that's very common with leash reactivity. So you just want to make sure that you are kind of, if you start now and then you measure it a month from now and see if you're really starting to make progress. Because you don't want to try to measure it day by day. It's something that takes some time to work through. All right, I know this video was a little bit longer than most of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in another video.